Hello, and welcome to another edition of At Home with the Roosevelts. I'm Paul Sparrow, the director of the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum in Hyde Park, New York. And today we're going to have a wonderful conversation about Eleanor Roosevelt with the author of the new book, Eleanor, David Michaelis. David, thank you very much for joining us today.
Delighted to be back in my favorite place.
So, David, I'm going to start with the question that I'm sure you've been asked before. Why another book on Eleanor right now?
The answer to that actually was one day at the FDR Library, which is that was then the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Research Room. It was just at that point under renovation. I think everybody agrees. Everyone who has the privilege of working there agrees it's one of the happiest places to work in this kind of work. But it was under renovation, and the documents in their cartons on great big trolleys were being moved out, and I was pretty new still to the world of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, and still in a sort of freshman year, rookie year kind of feeling about it, and was therefore daunted still to some extent by the mass of material. And as these trolleys began emerging and men were pushing them down the corridors, I kind of got my very first glimpse. I had heard, it was almost like a legend, sort of legend of Nanda Devi or legend of Everest, that Eleanor's papers were 1 million documents. And I had had some time in archives before, but that was a pure Himalayan scale of papers and record that I'd ever confronted. And I saw the cartons. I saw these 1 million documents beginning to roll. And I think I must have paled, because Bob Clark, then the supervising archivist, saw me. And he said to me, he came over to where I was standing, and he said, "David, this is why you're here. You need to select. We need a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that selects and that doesn't merely collect." And I think what Bob was saying was exactly why I had started, which is I always felt that Eleanor needed to be, in a way, liberated from the archives, and liberated in a sense from the feeling people had of her that she was homework, or that she was, it was time to eat your vegetables when you got to the Eleanor Roosevelt part of the story. Whereas Franklin was fun, he was fizzy, he was champagne, and he was the man in charge. He was the power. Whereas Eleanor was the supporting figure. I thought, well, it is time in our world today, in the 21st century, for a biography that seriously looks at her as the central figure of the story. And it's not in any way to take away from the Franklin Roosevelt part of the story. It's to say it's time to see Eleanor on the stage with the spotlight, and let's see what that looks like and how that goes.
Well, and you do a fantastic job. The book is really excellent. I particularly enjoyed some of the early chapters when you do, I think, one of the best jobs of revealing a more nuanced look at her childhood. There's the headline, dad, mom dies, raised by evil, grandmother, lonely childhood. But you really, I think, present a much more interesting matrix of the entire family. It was a complicated family with the Halls and the Livingstons and the Roosevelts and all these different people moving back and forth. And I really do think you did a wonderful job of capturing that. And it's one of the things that I talked about when I talk about Eleanor, which is that she was an extraordinary figure who really sort of emerges in those teenage years when she goes to England and studies under Miss Sylvester. Talk a little bit about that chrysalis moment, that emergence after this sort of dark childhood.
Well, one of the things that interested me in that period, and I got the chance, really just so fortuitous, that Eleanor Roosevelt's childhood home, that is to say, the one in which she lived longest, was her grandmother's. And it was at Tivoli on Hudson, north of Hyde Park. And I found sheer good fortune. I was able to spend a few days there. And there in that house, overlooking the Hudson, in rooms that she had inhabited, in her room, in her bedroom, in the rooms of her uncles, Valley and Eddie, in that family there that had previously, in my sense of it, was that it was a sort of dark, Edward Gorey-like Victorian household in which she had felt utterly oppressed. Actually, there was a great deal more joy there at certain times with her aunts and uncles. They were very glamorous when she first got there when she was young. Her Uncle Eddie and her Uncle Valley had been among the earliest tennis champions in the new game of lawn tennis. And as U.S. lawn tennis became U.S. tennis, these were the early champions, the early figures. They were descending as Eleanor approached her teenage years into alcoholism, into issues where they were totally dependent on their mother, Eleanor's grandmother, and she in turn was enabling them, even as terrible things happened with the courts. Valley was sued by a woman who he had abused. There was a lot of things that Eleanor was drawn into that she wasn't yet prepared for, but that as she was chosen to be the one to go into New York after another binge of Uncle Valley's, after Eddie had been dragged off by the police, and was now raising chickens off in Hempstead, Long Island, she took responsibility for her aunts and uncles, for Aunt Pussy, when she actually fell into a very tough time of her life. And in these periods, between the age of 15 and 19, she found increasingly greater strength each time that she found herself responsible for these problems and solving them and helping solve them. Then off she went to Madame Souvestre and Allenswood, and in that world, she got the message: you have a mind of your own. You are an individual. You must be able to depend on yourself. And let's hear what you have to say about the Boer War. Let's hear what you have to say about the United States government. And she realized, I think, for the very first time, that she did have this strength, both of mind and of character. And she had a leadership position at that school because there were an international group of girls. Others like herself were newcomers, were foreigners in England. But she immediately began speaking French. She had a fluency from her earliest governess. She could talk to adults. She had a relationship with Madame Souvestre that was not unlike the relationship she'd been creating with her aunts, where she was really called on to take an adult role with another adult, ahead of her years, beyond her years, and she succeeded. And in succeeding in these ways as an individual, as a leader, as someone who could begin to depend on her own strength, she became Eleanor Roosevelt. She began to be herself.
One of the things you talk about in her period at Allenwood are some of the friends she makes. She was with a very elite group of young women who really were being prepared for their adult life. But you tell a story from her correspondence that I had never heard before about one of those girls that she went to school with who went back to Germany, who wrote her a letter right around the time that Germany invades Poland, 1939, sort of asking forgiveness for Germany. Talk about that a little bit. I found that was a very interesting conversation, and Eleanor's response to her was very interesting as well.
Well, Carola was a girl from Germany, and when they met in Allenswood in 1900, 1901, 1902, they were young women from the elite worlds of their respective countries, from America and from Germany. As Poland was invaded, as the Second World War was beginning, and as Germany was drawn into the fascism, demagoguery, and then totalitarianism and aggression, worldwide aggression of Adolf Hitler, Carola was a normalizer. She wanted to have things be the way they were. And in her correspondence with Eleanor, I think she communicated this idea that she thought everything was going to be fine, and she thought taking a sort of normalized approach to the new leader was the way to go. Eleanor objected with her, but it was particularly afterward, after the war, when they corresponded, when Eleanor was going into Germany very early after the war to begin to raise the flag on how many displaced persons were in camps, were seeking asylum, seeking statehood, that she confronted her old boarding school friend and said, how do you justify this as a Christian? How do you justify this as a reasonable person? How do you justify it? And she never felt, I think, that she got an answer that persuaded her that Carola had really seen that Nazism and the disintegration of of truth in the world was something that she had changed on, and I think actually it was seeking her response, her honesty, and her truth that I think awakened, as always with Eleanor, the idea that human beings were not going to actually be acting quite so reasonably or quite so logically as you might have expected, and I think she was disappointed.
Yeah, that certainly comes across, and those letters were just part of, as you said, the million pages of documents we have around her, and so many of them are these letters, this correspondence between her and people that she knew, her and luminaries and dignitaries and celebrities, but then many of them are between her and just ordinary people. People when she came to the White House as a first lady. She did radio broadcasts in 1935. She started her daily column, My Day, and she encouraged people to write to her. And she really got just sort of some incredible outpouring of support and of criticism and of people asking for help. As you were going through this, I mean, it's clear from the book that there are certain letters that inspired you as much as others. When you look back on it, are there one or two letters that you really felt just were extraordinary in revealing either her character or the condition of America at that time?
I found that the correspondence with Lorena Hickok, which had been so much a part of the mystique around Eleanor when I began. I mean, I distinctly remember when I was beginning, there was a function on Google search where it would finish the sentence. It would be the most asked sentence at the time. For instance, is George Washington? And then it would be the next question would be alive. And you think, are you kidding? That many people really are still wondering if George Washington. And with Eleanor Roosevelt, it was, is Eleanor Roosevelt gay? Is Eleanor Roosevelt? That was the beginning of the sentence, and then gay ? And that was the most asked question in 2007, 2008. And the news of the Eleanor Roosevelt correspondence with Lorena Hickok was sort of still in the air. People were still wondering, questioning, and there was a movie about J. Edgar Hoover in which these letters appeared. In fact, they were sort of used as almost the sort of spiritual, or that's not the right word, but romantic center of the movie. And so when I began reading them, the actual documents, which is one of the greatest things about the FDR Library, is that there you sit, and the documents come out in cartons on trolleys, and you begin to look at the actual words and typewriting, the ribbon, the odd little markings of typewriter ribbon, or the actual handwriting. And Eleanor's, of course, famously, as everyone at the FDR Library will tell you, is atrocious. Yes, and Virginia was one of the Lemonick, I'm not going to get her last name correctly pronounced, but Virginia's was one of the great experts and taught me how to read certain things. Anyhow, you begin to start getting a sense, and as I did with these letters, and I'm not thinking of one in particular, although I must say the idea that the new First Lady of the United States, on her first night in the White House, would be in the up till this very moment of today, the one of the most difficult, crisis-ridden moments since the Civil War, as we are now again in a crisis unlike that which we have been in, would be thinking of a journalist whom she had fallen in love with or had extremely loving feelings for, and that she was writing to her. The last thing she did before going to sleep that night, her first night in the White House, was to write to Lorena Hickok. That really moved me because it made you realize how much in this relationship was already real, how much was going on between them, how much they depended on each other, and how Eleanor, as she shaped herself as First Lady, was shaping herself out of this daily correspondence and the things that were going on in it. It also similarly moved me, and I remember feeling very strongly about this, that the last letter she wrote in the White House, the last night before she left, after the cataclysm of FDR's sudden death, and in some sense premature early death, even though he seemed to be a very old man, he was not actually that old, and the war was not over. And Eleanor, as she moved out of the White House quickly in order to have a peaceful transfer, to the Trumans, and urgently wanted Harry Truman to feel comfortable, and her counterpart, Bess Truman. She wanted them both to feel comfortable, so much so that she put Bess in her place at the table the night she had them to dinner at the White House, and her children were very moved to see that she was no longer in her accustomed place. But that night, the last night, before leaving the White House for good, in April 19th, actually 1945, she wrote to Lorena Hickok again. And one of the things she said that night was so moving to me. She said, "I always felt safe with Franklin in the White House." And I remember thinking, wow, it really is something to think, when you think of the president in the White House, when you think that that's her husband, that's somebody that she knows so well and has known since she was 4 years old. And it's him in the White House, in power, that gave her that safe feeling.
I think one of the things that your book does is it helps examine this issue around Eleanor's close emotional relationships with people. We get the question here all the time about Eleanor's sexual orientation. And I always say, we don't know what happened behind closed doors. We have nothing to document that she had a sexual relationship with any of these people. But there is no doubt that she had a series of intense emotional relationships with men and women to fulfill the gap in her life that Franklin Roosevelt could not provide. Franklin Roosevelt could not give her the emotional connection that she desperately sought. So whether it was, the state trooper, or whether it was Lorena Hickok, or it was Joe Lash, or whether it was David Grayevich, or whoever you want throughout the course of her life, she needed that person that she had these intense emotional relationships with. And I think you do a very good job as you examine them, and especially with Earl Miller in those early days, and the complexity and the sensitivity of First Lady doing things that might be considered inappropriate, and yet she survived. How do you come to grips with that sequencing of relationships that she had outside of her marriage?
Well, I think it starts with her father, and I think that's actually one of the great values, and it's never quite clear for a while as you begin the research, but a single volume, putting a life into a single volume, is a crazy idea, especially when the life is as varied and as expansive as Eleanor Roosevelt's, going from the Victorian age to the atomic age. How can you possibly do that in one volume? But the great value is that you do begin to see, as a researcher, as a writer, you begin to see that these relationships have a pattern to them. And I found that once she had lost her father, the need for connection, the need to belong again to somebody on an intimate level, to feel that feeling of being loved and to connect, was something that she never lost. The sense of being disappointed as well, and in a very good faith sort of way. I mean, one of the things that's so poignant to me about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt as a couple is they both had such good faith, and I think romantic and idealistic feelings about each other, and wishing so much that this would work out. Always, I think they're very poignant. Isn't that every marriage, that we all want it all to work out? We're all human beings. I think their acceptance of themselves as human beings through the great obstacles and torments and difficulties of their life is such a familiar story to all of us. But it's seeing all together the pattern of Eleanor that actually makes me, to me, the most inappropriate thing that Eleanor Roosevelt ever did with Earl Miller, or that a first lady did with someone who was her bodyguard, was setting time aside in her unbelievably busy schedule to go to a small little cottage that he lived in outside Albany to clean up after him, to use her Swifter, to put things in order, to be a mom, to be not a wife, but because that's so sexist, but to be somebody who was doing something for somebody else and being useful to the one you love. What greater gift could she give? I think she always felt that in order to be loved, she needed to be useful. That was something she had learned from her childhood, but I think she literally enacted it. And when I discovered that she and Earl Miller sort of kept house for one another, I thought, wow. That is, imagine today that, but it's so tender and it's so poignant and so Eleanor. And after a while, it began to seem that was the way she actually connected to people, and people loved her for it. And so.
Yeah. And there's the question of whether they were surrogate sons or surrogate lovers or surrogate something. But you cast, to change the subject a little bit, you cast a somewhat cold and critical eye on Franklin Roosevelt in many of his decisions. I think you portray him perhaps occasionally overly harsh, but I do think you go to the core issue between the two of them, which was that he was ultimately a pragmatist. He believed in compromise. He wanted to get things done. And Eleanor was an absolutist. You know, she was the conscience. She believed there's right and there's wrong, and you do the right thing, even if you fail to accomplish what you set out to accomplish. And FDR was, we're going to accomplish what I need to accomplish, whatever it means I have to compromise on. And I think you do, particularly in the whole story about the anti-lynching laws that Eleanor fought so hard for, and some of the other legislative battles that were being fought, where Eleanor, had to walk a very fine line between her beliefs and Franklin's political ability to move the country forward. As you looked at that complexity to their relationship, what did you draw from that? What did you learn from how their relationship survived both the conflicts and the emotional void?
Well, I also, maybe it'll help explain my point of view about Franklin Roosevelt. My earliest feeling about the book was that it was almost a sort of guilty pleasure. I thought, oh, well, I won't have to spend time in the several million documents of Franklin Roosevelt. And then, of course, realized almost immediately how wrong I was and what a complete illusion that was. You do have to study. If you study Eleanor Roosevelt, you of course have to study Franklin. But I did realize as I began writing the book that my point of view had to stay with her. And so the harshness that you correctly identify often, I think, came from trying to keep my point of view, trying to keep the reader seeing the story through her eyes. And I think for Eleanor, marriage to Franklin Roosevelt, but also politics with Franklin Roosevelt, could sometimes be a harsh experience. And I think that's what I was trying, not so much as an effect, but as a reality. And I think that it's extremely hard to see someone whose judgment is as good as Franklin's was, to see his hands tied. And that may have new meaning even this week when we see ties being brought into the House chamber for literal tying of hands of legislators. It's very hard, I think, when you see somebody, as Eleanor did, with Franklin on lynching, with Franklin even on civil rights, where he really genuinely wanted to move things forward and couldn't. His hands were tied by the Southern Democrats and their hold on his own legislation, on the party, on the Democratic Party, on almost every advance he wanted to make. He had to get the Southern coalition as part of his team. And so he did have to play a very, very canny, shrewd game of chess on almost everything. I think that's hard to watch from Eleanor's point of view. I think it was hardest of all in the probably now unequivocal error Franklin made in terms of interning Americans who were of Japanese origins in the panic and fear that followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, and the stripping of civil rights we now see in a different light. The stripping of civil rights of those citizens we see in a different light. Eleanor objected behind the scenes. She was loyal publicly to Franklin's point of view. He was getting messages from his attorney general that this was not the right thing to do and that precedent could be used and so forth. We've now studied that. We see that clearly. I think at the time it was very hard to go through if you were in Eleanor's shoes. She, in fact, was drawn into several times to visit the camps in Arizona, in Southern California, to where there was unrest and there was difficulties. She was brought in to try to help solve the problems, which in one sense she did. I think that's over and over again, you see opportunities of a president like Franklin Roosevelt, and in Franklin's case, of course, multiplied by 4 terms, where you think, how could you not have? Well, it's impossible. You can't look backward from today's morals or today's point of view. But you can see how it affected their relationship. And I think Eleanor and he both frustrated each other and utterly depended on and respected and trusted each other as in their partnership in the White House. And there's no question about that. That's what makes their partnership so worthy of repeated study and of our attention now. They are every couple, and they are one of the most progressive and modern couples in our history. They are tolerant. They understand that they are not going to fulfill each other at every turn, but that they can accept and depend on each other's respective points of view to carry the day when times are at their absolute toughest.
Now, you do a wonderful job of documenting the drumbeat of grim news and sorrow and loss throughout her life, her parents' deaths, her brother's deaths, the betrayal with Franklin, with Lucy Mercer. But, and I talk about this when I give people tours, if you think about April 12th, 1945, she learns that her husband has died. She loses her job. She loses her home. She finds out he was with his former mistress, and that her own daughter had been arranging secret rendezvous between her husband and his former mistress. And yet she presented to the world such a face of dignity and strength. I mean, I get choked up every time I think about that. Talk about that transition from her role as First Lady to her role as First Lady of the world.
It's clearly the moment in which a human being becomes something greater than any possible prediction. We could have predicted a number of things about Eleanor based on who she was as First Lady of New York and First Lady of the United States. But to see her advance into what is a completely new age, I mean, the dropping of the atomic bomb, Harry Truman taking over a White House and an administration that he knew so little about, and Eleanor suddenly being called by him into the service of the country as its earliest representative to a body of nations that didn't yet have a name, although United Nations was what FDR had hoped it would be called, and Churchill as well had used that name. But to think of uniting nations at a time where there was so little trust. Anxiety was the order of the day. Eleanor Roosevelt could represent her husband's legacy as a widow. She could have simply appeared places and done a remarkable thing for the world by representing the values of one of the great figures of World War II, of freedom, of liberty, of human need, of human rights. She could just have shown up, or she could have just simply faded away. She did neither. She literally jumped in at Harry Truman's insistence and became somebody who, I think when the world looks back and you try to figure out how is it that she created a document that we really know very little about. I mean, I think people in general, if you sat them down and gave them a little quiz, myself included, when I began, on what are the rights that are discussed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, agreed upon by the United Nations in 1948, what would we be all talking about? Well, a lot of people wouldn't, I think, get many of them, and they wouldn't even think very many. But what a human being was then was something new, and it was something new to see somebody and a commission try to get 55 countries to agree on what a human being was, what a human being deserved, and what a human being in the new world of potential annihilation, of world and global interdependence, in a time of complete distrust, what would that look like? And I think Eleanor was probably, arguably, one of 5 or 10 people whom you could even have nominated for the job. But I think in the end, when she received the standing ovation upon passage on December 10th, 1948, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set forth a guideline, a pattern for the world to go forward in its most fragile state of how we would depend on each other, how we would begin to see and coexist in a new world. It was agreed upon that she was the only one who could have done it, and she did it by listening. Of course, it sounds corny, but by being a listener, an active listener, a power listener, but also by having brought people together in a way where she didn't challenge and undercut and bring the United States in as the power that it was, the unique world, the sole world power of that moment. She brought the United States in as a co-partner with the Soviet Union, with all of the other countries that were involved, and the women who were involved in the commission that created the Declaration of Human Rights were as important, if not more important, person by person, as the men. Eleanor also was, of course, part of that.
Yeah, we're starting to run out of time, so I have two final questions. The first, the period in the 1950s and 1960s. Again, a lot of people today don't realize Eleanor Roosevelt was, without a doubt, the most famous American woman in the world. Really, until Jackie Kennedy came along, the most recognizable, the most significant American woman in the world. She had enormous political power, and yet she still sort of carried her own suitcase and made her own travel arrangements. But I want to talk about her relationship with John F. Kennedy, because it covered several different issues: McCarthy, civil rights, the presidency, and talk a little bit about how she interfaced with active serving politicians, but particularly with John F. Kennedy, whom she had known since he was a boy.
Yeah, and actually had known since he was a boy and distrusted him as a politician. And in fact, her turning around on John F. Kennedy is a signature Eleanor Roosevelt move to actually have very strong and realistic feelings about somebody. She doubted that John Kennedy was going to be his own man. She thought he was an extension of his own father, partly because he had not censured McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was a friend of the family, was a friend of the Kennedy family, and was somebody who Eleanor perceived rightly was one of the great sources of evil in the United States in the 50s. And we see strains of McCarthyism in Trumpism, but we also at the time understood that McCarthy was running a scam, and Eleanor Roosevelt saw through it immediately. She reacted strongly when she saw Kennedy advancing onto the national stage without having come clean, she felt, on his feelings about McCarthy. When he did, when he actually showed that he did have the country first in his thinking, that his mind was extremely supple, agile. She recognized that he was a leader. She saw that he could be independent and that he had his own thinking, and that he was more than just a pretty face. And I think that's the famous line where she said, we'd like the senator to have a little less profile and a little more courage. I think she was talking, of course, about McCarthy, but she was sort of saying, I'm the de facto head of the party. I haven't yet accepted this upstart. And when she did, which was the summer of 1960, as Kennedy was running for the presidency and beginning to show signs of the statesman that he would become in office, someone who learned on the job, she recognized in him what she had not seen, for instance, in Adlai Stevenson, whom she had supported twice, and she felt after a certain point she could see that Stevenson didn't have a way of connecting to people. Kennedy did. Stevenson withdrew into his own fears, into his own uncomfort. Kennedy was a natural. Kennedy was somebody who had the agenda of the New Deal in his thoughts, but was going to create his own, obviously, his own policies. And she was never one to say, for this, I want this. She did not ask for cabinet level appointments for people such as Stevenson, whom she was favoring. But Kennedy was somebody that she knew was going to be a world figure, that he had the potential to go onto the national stage and bring a strong America into the world. We needed that in 1960.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And their relationship is fascinating, and their correspondence is really interesting. But the final question is going to be about Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy today and her relevance today. But a brief story, one of my favorites. In 1959, Premier Khrushchev came to the United States, went to Washington, had the big state dinner with Eisenhower, went to New York, and then came up to Hyde Park to visit Eleanor Roosevelt at her home at Valk Hill, to tour the library and museum, and of course to pay his respects at FDR's gravesite. One of my very favorite pictures shows Khrushchev and his entourage and all the security folks, and Eleanor is giving them a tour of the library, and she's pointing her finger at him, and just to the side of Khrushchev, you see his young translator leaning forward with this look of horror on his face, realizing he's about to have to say this clearly lecture to Khrushchev, the most powerful man in Russia. And it's just one of those fabulous moments. She's, of course, the only woman in the picture. And, she had been arguing with Khrushchev both publicly and privately for years. But it does go to show that she was fearless in her ability to confront those in power, challenge them, and to get her opinion out there. So final question, her relevance today, her legacy, how important is it?
I think what Eleanor stood for, and what we need more than ever today, is her message that a robust government is needed to protect our freedoms, individual freedoms and the freedoms of our nation. And I think Eleanor Roosevelt was the one who stepped forward and let you know that this government that she was part of belonged to you, and that you belonged to it. You had a role to play in it. You actually had a few duties. Voting was one, but another was to be present in a way that she was also at any infringement upon liberty. And I think that the essential idea of government as a powerful place of individuals for individuals who want liberty and who need to have certain rights and freedoms in order to pursue happiness, in order to do the things that are promised, comes from government, and government is not the enemy. That was a success, I think, in those days. We need to make it a success again. We need to teach civics again. I think Eleanor is the figure who people look to and think of when they think of good government. And if that is the legacy that she brings forward into the 21st century, I think she'd be very happy to have that. I wanted to say one more thing, which is my sense of the Khrushchev visit was that there was a lovely Eleanor moment where the Khrushchev's security team and the American security team were having a terrible face-off over where Premier Khrushchev would enter the library, because the entrance itself was deemed by the Soviets to be they were unable to protect him in the front entrance, whereas the rear entrance was a place which I think went into, I can't remember exactly which room it went into, but it was a very unassuming place in the back.
It was the loading dock.
Sorry, the loading docks. Thank you. Exactly. That the loading dock was where they could safely bring him in, but that it wasn't a grand enough entrance. And Eleanor consulted on this, I think, as I recall, but Paul, you'll remember it better than I, offered the very practical Eleanor Roosevelt solution to just write the word entrance on a cardboard, shirt cardboard, and stick it up over the loading dock. And I think, as I recall, that's sure enough what happened. Something like that, where they brought him in through the entrance.
Nice, of course. And Eleanor always coming up with a practical solution. A more entertaining and unknown part of the story is that she got a call very early in the morning. He was coming up from the Russian delegation saying that they were going to be getting there a little early, and she would need to have 3 bottles of vodka prepared for them for breakfast. And so she had to send her son John, who was living in Stone Cottage out front, to knock on neighbors' doors and try to find a liquor store that was open to get the vodka for the Khrushchev team.
Oh my gosh, pretty
David,
exotic, actually.
Your new book, Eleanor, one of the great contributions to the Roosevelt literature. You do a fantastic job. I hope when the library reopens, we can get you up here for a program in person. I know our Our audience would love to have you here. Thank
Any
you.
chance to get back to the FDR Library. Thank you, and thank the FDR. Thank you, the FDR, and thank you, Eleanor, for leaving your papers to the American people.
And that's it for this edition of At Home with the Roosevelts. We hope we'll see you again soon.